This is a toolbox and a toolkit, and I'm going to let them run everything, but I'm just going to introduce Carrie Levine, who joined the Center for Public Integrity in October 2014 as a federal politics reporter. And before that, she was a research director at Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington. Shane Goldmacher is a senior political correspondent for the National Journal, and he is covering the 2016 presidential campaign, and previously covered Congress and congressional campaigns, and produces, of course, investigative stories that focus on money and politics. So I'm going to let them take it away.
Thanks everyone for coming, and I want to thank everyone who was involved in organizing this conference, which has been terrific. So we're here to talk about following money in politics, and really why anyone would want to, given how complicated it sounds and terrible, and the charts that Andy put up, which really just could give anyone a headache. So there's a lot of data out there, and you've heard people touch on it throughout the sessions yesterday and today. There's campaign contributions, there's spending, there's nonprofit spending, there's data on super PACs and joint fundraising committees and national parties and advertising data and lobbying data. It can be very overwhelming if you don't work with it every day. And we're here to really talk to you about how you can use it to build a story. Data by itself is only so interesting. The trick is how you report it out and use it to shape a narrative, tell a story, and turn it into something that can be interesting to real people who, as everyone has pointed out, are not spending their lives immersed in this. So a lot of stories about money in politics just talk about the amount a donor contributed or the amount a candidate raised. And those stories have to be written. But I think the key is showing the reader why those things matter. Why do we care how much someone donated, or why do we care how much a candidate raised? And the answer is that the answer tells you why things are happening. It tells you why things are happening the way they are. And so the questions that we need to ask are, okay, so why am I telling this story? What data is going to help me tell it? And what are people getting out of what they're giving? And why are candidates so desperate to raise all this money? And so the answers tend to be complicated and interesting, and I think that's really where the best stories are. So that's what we're here to talk about. Why do people raise so much money? What do they spend it on? And why do people give it? So I think there were a couple things I wanted to throw out before we really get going on this, and I turn this over to Shane. One is that as I went back through stories to prepare for this panel and think about the anatomy of those stories and the data that I used to build them and why I picked what I did, the best stories really use a lot of different data sets, pieces of different data sets to paint a picture. So much isn't disclosed now that you have to find bits and pieces of the puzzle in different places. So it's pretty rare you're going to find a whole story from one data set, at least a more complicated, bigger story, and that's something to keep in mind. And then another thing is that just because something is in a filing doesn't mean it's true. So don't give up on your repertorial instincts here. If something looks too good to be true, it usually is. There's mistakes in these filings all the time. It is always worth calling and asking a question. And then the third piece that I'd say is really nothing beats talking to people, getting out of the office and seeing what something looks like, and making sure that what's in the filing is true by actually backing it up. So we're here to talk about data, and data is important, but also you're all reporters, you all know how to do this. You all know how to use the data and back it up, and it's easy when you look at all of this to lose sight of that because it's so complicated and it's so difficult to get people to talk to you when they're trying to hide something, but that really is the key to these stories.
Great. Well, I want to talk about a couple parts about campaign finance reporting. The first one is why do it? And I want to give you guys a totally selfish reason that has nothing to do with holding people to account and all of those things, which is it's far less competitive, especially when you're talking about a presidential race, than the horse race coverage. And there's 100 people in South Carolina right now. At this big summit, there's probably 50 people covering Jeb Bush's speech. Almost nobody's going to get something original out of that. But if you spent the same amount of time, you're probably the only person looking at XYZ campaign filing. And I think it makes a huge difference. Also, it's a great equalizer. It doesn't matter what media outlet you're at. If you're at the New York Times or if you're at a small outlet, you have equal access to the information that's publicly available. And you have equal access to information that you can make Public Records Act requests of. And so you basically are able to play in the same playground as the people who are getting all their phone calls returned because you have information that most people aren't looking for. And I do think it's a great advantage, especially starting out or at smaller outlets. You get your calls returned when you're calling about something that's original or data that you've found or dots that you've put together. And the single biggest sort of piece of advice before we get into some of the specifics is really something that Carrie just touched on, which is basically anytime you're looking at any data set, whether it's somebody's filings at the FEC, whether it's nonprofit information, it's really important to treat that data just like you would any other source. That means you have source maintenance. You go regularly and you get in contact and you make sure you're familiar with it. You interview, basically. You sit down and you ask it questions and you see what it spits out. And whatever is the most interesting set of things, that's the story you're going to write, just as if you're going to go talk to people. And also, as she mentioned, sometimes that data is wrong. So I was going to pull up one sort of very fun moment, especially since he already got a lot of attention today. Sheldon Adelstein is not the name you've heard before, but it's the name on this transaction right here. So the amount of money you think that he spent in the 2014 elections based on all the reporting you've seen, it's wrong, because he had his name misspelled on this filing. So by $500,000, almost every report in the country that says how much money Sheldon spent in the 2014 elections is wrong. This has not been corrected. It's just Las Vegas Sands. This is his casino. This is his address. This is his size of check. It's just not in the data. So again, you can find wrong information everywhere. People's names are misspelled. Amounts can be wrong, typos, etc. So it's really important as you go through this to look at this and ask questions. And sometimes things don't make sense, and sometimes it's because they're wrong. Sometimes you found a great story, and sometimes there's just not a story there at all. So I was going to start. We're going to walk through a couple of the key websites, pretty like a dime tour of them, and I'm going to start with the FEC. FEC, Federal Election Commission, if you guys have heard of it, probably, houses basically all the campaign finance data for federal campaigns. Their website is notoriously bad. It's difficult to navigate. I've spoken with 2 FEC commissioners who have admitted to me privately that they can't find the information they're always looking for on their own website, and sometimes they use Open Secrets, which is the basically charticle version of the FEC data. But I'm going to give you guys just a quick tour of how you start the most basic things. And I'm going to go quickly through the simplest things and a little slower for the more complicated stuff. The first one is this first tab on the left-hand side is the tab if you're looking up data. And the most basic thing you can do is go to searchable systems. Makes sense, you're searching. No, the search bar up here does not work. Don't use that to search for somebody's name because that would be too simple. Searchable systems, and you can click on a candidate and committee viewer. And when you go there, basically at this point, you can search for any political campaign committee by name or any political candidate by name. You can just do a last name. You can do all basic permutations, and you will get a longer list depending on how you go through this. And I'm going to show you just the basics of when you look up somebody. So we're going to look up Nancy Pelosi. We'll search for Pelosi, and you're going to see a bunch of results. And this comes up for almost any politician you search for. When you search for their name, it's not just one committee. They have a joint fundraising committee, which Eliza touched on briefly. Basically, you can create a jumbo committee to get pools of donations and then distribute it to multiple committees later. Typically, though, when you're talking about a politician, and especially a presidential campaign, if you want to talk about their campaign apparatus, it's going to say principal campaign committee of a candidate. That doesn't mean you're capturing all the money they're raising, and especially complicated now, if you talk about a Marco Rubio, a Rand Paul, or a Ted Cruz, they will have a victory committee or a joint committee where they raise bigger campaign contributions and put some of it into their official campaign committee, some of it into a leadership PAC, some of it into political parties. It gets very complicated, but the most basic element for folks is a principal campaign committee. There's only one hyperlink here, and this is pretty much the same for any member of Congress or candidate for Congress, or Senate, or president. You search for their name, you'll have usually an array of options. So let's click on Nancy Pelosi. On every candidate committee's page, you're going to have basically two different ways to digest the information. The first is the actual filings. And so this is how they turn their filings into the FEC. And it's in PDF form, basically. You can see each of their filings as a PDF. It's 461 pages. You can scroll through the whole thing. And for members of Congress, you're filing quarterly. This is by far the most difficult way to look through a form. I don't want to scroll through 461 pages. You don't want to scroll through 461 pages. You can't also total things up. It's not in an Excel sheet. It's not in any kind of functional, usable way. Now, sometimes you look through this just to glance, and especially if you see something that seems wrong, I'll pull up the PDF. Again, that's how you find a Sheldon Adelstein instead of Adelson. But this is sort of a second tier for me typically. Now, everybody's different, but I think that the PDF is less useful than the other tier, which is the summary data that they have on the left. Why is this more useful? Because it's sortable, and they basically are doing the hard work for you of turning it into sortable information. You can look at both expenditures and contributions. So again, we're at Nancy Pelosi for the first 3 months of this year. Click on operating expenditures. You'll open up a new tab, and they basically have easily sortable. Here's all the things she spent money on. For whatever reason, when you hit amount, it goes to the smallest first. Why anyone would want the smallest first, I don't know. This is the FEC's website. And you can see what she spent the most money on. And the great part about campaign finance data is almost anything you possibly look for, you can find a story. And I will actually get it in a minute, but credit this, preparing for this, for the story I wrote this week, which is that Rand Paul spent $100,000 buying randpaul.com. And I found that simply because I was preparing for this presentation. I saw Rand Paul's name. I clicked on it. I went into his operating expenditures, and I did what I just did here, sorted by amount, and the second amount was $100,000 for a domain name. And that's all it took. And again, that filing had been out for a month. Nobody had done that yet. It is far less competitive. There's not enough people doing this at the presidential level, certainly at the Senate level, and almost certainly at the House level. The best part about this data is you have it here in a way that you can kind of use. If you are comfortable with Microsoft Excel or any other database software, you can download the data right up there, and you can just use it and sort it as you would like, pull it apart in different ways, etc. Every federal campaign committee, their expenditures and their contributions are downloadable. So you can see where did they spend their money by zip code, where did they raise their money by zip code, who did they spend it, quarter after quarter, year after year, all these sort of general comparisons. That's the basics, and that's really what I'm going to cover to start of looking up a particular candidate's campaign cash at the federal level. My favorite part of the FEC's website, and the part that you can pretty much guarantee to find a story in every single section every day you click on it, is the data catalog, which is this part on the left. And I'm going to go back to the home page just because that's where you're going to start to navigate for things. Again, you go to click on this campaign finance disclosure portal, and on the left is a data catalog. And underneath the data catalog is a whole bunch of things that they basically are aggregating, not just one or two candidates, but candidates across the entire Federal Election Commission database. And they put it all in one place for you where you can compare them instantaneously. So, for instance, you want to see independent expenditures, which is outside groups spending money to impact federal campaigns. At any given moment, you can see all the most recent federal independent expenditures in the country in real time as they're filing them. You can see, for instance, an outside super PAC is spending money printing ads for Ted Cruz. You can see that the American Dental Association is spending money for Ed Holiday. And this is kind of where I'm going to tell you that's, in fact, the way I came across another story in the past, which is it turns out that the American Dental Association spends huge amounts of money only to elect dentists year after year, because it turns out, shockingly, that having dentists in Congress, they introduce pro-dentist legislation. And when they have pro-dentist legislation, the Dental Association is really happy. How do you come across that story? I don't know. What I just did was looking at the FEC's list of most recent campaign expenditures for independent expenditures, and guess what? At the very top of the list, and this is an old story, right? This is a story I did last cycle. is the American Dental Association. If you Google Ed Holiday, you will be shocked to find out he is a dentist. The American Dental Association, as I sort of dug into that story, and Carrie's going to get into these things a little bit too, you basically end up starting with one data set, and then you move to the next one. So you start with one place, you say, oh, this is strange, and I'm doing an interview, right? What is going on here? The American Dental Association, I don't know, what is it, May? This is strange. Well, it turns out, okay, A, this is a special election, and B, this guy's a dentist. Maybe there's a story. Maybe everybody they spend money for is dentists. Anyway, this is the data catalog. That's just one example. I will show you how I came across the Rand Paul story by preparing for this presentation. I clicked on candidate summary. Again, this is for the first 3 months of this year. And you can sort by who spent the most money of every federal campaign in the country. It's pretty cool that you can do this with just one single click. Again, it sorts smallest first every time. I don't know why. And you see the 3 biggest spenders of the first 3 months of the year. John Boehner, not a huge surprise. He's giving money away to the political party. He's giving money away to his members. Pat Toomey, who's an endangered Senate Republican running up for re-election in a fairly blue state, probably one of the most endangered Senate Republicans. And Rand Paul. And it was here that I said, oh, well, I cover Rand Paul. I should probably look at this filing. And so I clicked on his filing. I sorted it by amount. And sure enough, $100,000 for a domain name showed up. Lastly, the single most important piece of information, and I would write this down, this is the only thing I will suggest you write down the entire presentation, is the phone number for the FEC's press office. The FEC press office does not speak on the record about almost anything because they let the commission speak for themselves. But the press office does answer your questions and help you navigate their website. They literally sit there, the phone rings, and then their job is to help you find what you're looking for. And if you can't find what they're looking for, they will find somebody within the FEC, a computer person, to help look for it for you. They will do your work for you if you call them and are very nice. They're pretty nice if you're nice. Their phone number is 202-694-1220. I give you that number because, again, this is the FEC's website. It's not that easy to find almost anything there.
Don't tell them Shane said to call.
Yeah. Yeah. So I was at this thing. They're going to not return my phone calls now. I'm going to show you a couple of other very quick websites and give you kind of the dime tour of Open Secrets, which multiple folks have mentioned. Basically, Open Secrets compiles all the FEC data from nonprofits in all kinds of places and puts it out in sort of usable format that's viewer-friendly. You can kind of see charts and lists and the like. And you go through it, and it's a much, much easier way to get like a snapshot. They also compare different things, industries. Basically, the FEC gives you raw data. Open Secrets, I don't know, makes it all happy and usable.
Comparable.
And yeah, you can compare things that you can otherwise not compare. Campaign spending to other things, what industries are giving to what committees in Congress, things the FEC doesn't provide for you, Open Secrets does. I'm going to give you just a really, really quick example. If you click on congressional races, you can search by somebody's last name. So let's look at Jean Shaheen. I'm going to misspell her name. Maybe. You get all kinds of different data. What industries have contributed to her, exactly how much she raised, who her top contributors are, who her top sectors of contributors are. I'm going to go through this relatively quickly. This is not information you have somewhere else. And this is great if you are writing a story about what industries are interested in influencing what people, on what committees. And we talk about outcomes, and it's something that David brought up and others brought up. If you want to tie where the money's coming from and the outcomes they're getting, this is a great tool to start to sort of look through that. The other website that I wanted to tell you guys about is the Sunlight Foundation. We have somebody here from the Sunlight Foundation. They have all kinds of great tools. The most sort of basic and fun is called Party Time. But if you go to Sunlight Foundation/tools, you can find almost all of their tools. Party Time basically lists all the congressional and presidential level fundraisers they receive. So you can look up and say who's holding fundraisers. And guess what? When Congress is in session, the fundraisers go up. During appropriation season, the appropriation fundraisers go up. You can sort of make these ties. Now, they do not have a comprehensive list. It's actually really, really far from comprehensive, but it is a snapshot of what is going on. And you can look. Here are all the fundraising events they have coming up in the near future. And you can just scroll through and see who's raising money from whom, who's the hosts, all kinds of great information. There's one other piece of the Sunlight Foundation that I'd like to point out because it's one of my favorite things, and it is their Influence Explorer website. Let's see, it's real time. I showed you guys how you can look up the most recent independent expenditures. If you go to, and I think we've provided this link to you in a handout, but the realtime.influenceexplorer.com, you can basically see every committee filing as it comes into the FEC. So you can look up any given day who's making what filings, which is very useful to basically get a snapshot of time. Particularly cool at the Sunlight Foundation is if you search for a particular candidate committee here from this website, this part of the real-time thing, search for Rand Paul. This will filter for me. It may or may not filter, but if you click on the particular campaign committee, you can sign up to get an email alert the moment it files. So for any particular political committee that you are interested in, every time they send something to the FEC, you get an email saying they filed something at the FEC. You don't have to go searching and reloading constantly. It comes right to you. So that's the sort of set of websites I was going to go over, and Carrie's going to go over some other ones.
And the two of them put together a great handout, which is available on the website too, but I'll pass it around so they have all the links.
And I should say one other thing, which is that we want to take questions throughout. If you guys have any questions about any part of the website or the like, do ask.
So I know sometimes staring at websites during a presentation isn't super fun, so I'm hoping people will jump in with questions. I told Shane that because lobbying, I used to be a lobbying reporter specifically, and so I still think the lobbying filings are among the most fun that any reporter can ever have, and I still check them every day because it's an old habit. So excuse me as I indulge, but lobbying is the other cornerstone of money in politics, right? So we know from the campaign finance data that people are giving money to political candidates and to members of Congress and to presidential candidates. What we don't always know is what they want or why they want it. Well, very often people lobby, and there are lobbying filings. So what I'm showing you now are lobbying filings that are required under the law to be submitted to Congress. And they're submitted quarterly, and lots of people lobby. For instance, we've heard a lot about the Koch brothers. So it turns out that the Coke companies lobby. And if you do a search, you can, and I put it in client name here. There's different ways to search, and we don't necessarily have time to go through all of them, but I'm happy to answer questions at another time. You can search the filings and find out about the lobbying by the Coke companies. And so what I'm doing now is sorting it by year. So the most recent filings are at the top. And so what you can see is the Coke companies have quite a few lobbyists on retainer. You could see their names on the left. And they do a fair amount of lobbying, and they're hiring, right? Like, here's a 2015 lobbying registration. So you can click on an entry and get a lobbying form with a lot more information that tells you which firm is doing the lobbying, the business of the client, and then here it lists all the lobbyists, and so you can see who they've hired, and in many cases they have to disclose what official position they've had. So for instance, they hired a lobbyist who used to be a deputy chief of staff to Senator Trent Lott. And so from that, you can sort of get some information about maybe who they're trying to lobby, what contacts the lobbying may have, and you go down and they have to give you some information about what they're lobbying on. And it's not always as specific as, say, I would personally like. Some of these have bill numbers and things like that, and I find that very helpful. And you can search by that. If you're interested in who's lobbying on a particular bill, there's a way to search the bill number. None of these searches are perfect. Again, just to stress how flawed some of this data is, and I know Eliza knows this, and some other folks in here have dealt with this for years, but there are different ways to search. And there are some interesting ways to search that people don't usually. For instance, you can search to see if there's any foreign entity. They have to disclose if there's any foreign entity who's paying a significant portion of the bill on this form. They have to disclose for instance, if you're looking at a coalition and you're thinking who's backing this coalition, who's paying the bills on this coalition, they have to theoretically disclose that under the affiliated organizations section of this form. Now, there are ways around all of these things. There are loopholes in the Lobbying Disclosure Act that are bigger than this room, but at least it gives you a place to start and some different ways to search. And so I'm a big fan of lobbying data, and one of my favorite things to do is to write myself a little note when a company gets in trouble and is getting hauled before Congress in some sort of investigation. And then in 45 days, when new registrations have to be disclosed, I go back and check the lobbying database and see if anything's popped up. I remember during the Toyota recalls, they were hiring up pretty extensively, and the Johnson & Johnson recalls, they hired up pretty extensively. And the BP oil spill, everyone was hiring. So it's a nice way to see, if a company knows it's in trouble, who it's hiring. And so I try and keep an eye on that. And when you're writing a story about why someone might be giving to members of Congress or why an industry might be giving to members of Congress, these forms can help guide you to figure out what issues they have going on, why they might be interested in influencing the political process. So that's a start. Then there's a database that really almost no one looks at because it's relatively new. This was a database created after the Jack Abramoff lobbying scandal. I don't know how many of you are familiar with that. So there was a law passed in 2007 called the Honest Leadership and Open Government Act that was a response to the Jack Abramoff scandal. And essentially it said, well, this is terrible. Members of Congress replied with gifts. There's all these ways around this, and there's all these ways to influence Congress. We're going to reform the system. And we could have a whole other conference as to whether that legislation was effective. I'm probably going to come down on no. But it did require lobbyists to file forms to disclose twice a year when they're honoring members of Congress and certain public officials. So you can't just go and throw a dinner and honor members of Congress or your regulators and not disclose it to the public.
Carrie,
Yes?
I think it's a little hard to see in the back. If you could just tell us what you're typing in. that'd be
Sure. I am going to tell you what I'm typing in. What I'm typing in is Time Warner under the registrant name, and under honoree I'm typing in Clyburn. And hopefully this is going to work today. But basically, as I'm sure you're all aware, Time Warner and Comcast were considering a merger until very recently. And the FCC regulates that sort of thing. So let's see if I can find that. At one point, I was looking at these forms, and I found Time Warner spending money on a dinner to honor Mignon Clyburn. And I think they've amended the form because they wound up taking the money back after the public had a bit of an outcry. But Mignon Clyburn is one of the FCC commissioners. So if you look at these forms and you go down far enough, you can find them honoring members of Congress or their regulators spending money to do that. And so they have to disclose all that sort of thing here. And I'm not doing a very good job pulling it up at the moment. But these forms can be very useful when you're looking for companies who are just, throwing a dinner to honor the person who approves their multi-million-dollar merger. So they're worth checking twice a year for that kind of thing. And then the other database that I was going to show you very quickly, because we've shown you a lot here, I was going to show you two databases that have to do with nonprofit filings. And things that have to do with nonprofit filings. One of them is GuideStar, which tracks Form 990s. It's free. You have to register. But if you go and you register, you can just do a basic search for any nonprofit. And I'm typing in Crossroads GPS because that's one of the biggest, which did not produce a result, so that's not great. Here's the American Action Network, which is a politically active nonprofit. And you can click on it, and it will give you the Forms 990 tax filings and things like that that are provided by the nonprofit. And you can pull them up from here, and it's free, and it's searchable, and they have a lot of things. You can also get those forms directly from the IRS and from other places, but this is a pretty centralized place to start. This is where I usually start looking for something. So those are pretty useful things to know for the different kinds of groups that we're dealing with. And I will turn it back over to Shane.
Well, I think we probably wanted to
Unless
take
we
some
wanna start
questions.
take some
Yeah,
questions.
take some questions. We can walk through some particular stories if you guys don't. But yeah, let's start with some questions.
Hi, I'm Evan Helper with the LA Times. Thank you guys for the presentation. One thing we're often trying to do in this reporting is figure out who was at fundraisers when the money came in. And I found that I used to be able to look at like a bunch of checks coming in a certain date, and that was kind of a surefire way. But it seems like now politicians have started, especially for these like destination fundraisers, which they, congressional members hold. You sign up for a club ahead of time, and then you can go to an event 6 months later. But do you have any advice other than just kind of aggregating, a bunch of people giving on a date, how to track down who was at a fundraiser when?
They've actively made that harder. Part of the thing you mentioned, the biggest issue is, especially for the biggest donors, they'll often max out at the beginning of a cycle, and that will give them the right to go to all future events that the campaign will hold. So like, there's almost no way to tie the date of the contribution coming to a particular event. Sometimes they hand over the check in real time. Sometimes they pay months in advance because they want people to book up, to know how many rooms to book, so they need to know that you're contributing. I don't know that I found a good way to tie specific events and the amount of money raised to it, other than sort of something Andy mentioned, like showing up, and if you stand in the hallway, you get to see who's coming in and out.
I would agree with that. It's become increasingly difficult because people give those checks ahead of time, and sometimes that's intentional. There are still members of Congress who do sort of, pass the bag at the event, and you will see that cluster of dates, but it's getting increasingly more difficult. It is true that when you're able to get the fundraiser invitation, sometimes there's a very long list of hosts, and so that's another great way to get at least a sampling of who was at the event, but it is getting harder.
Hi. Hi, Candace Smith from ABC News. You sort of touched on this a little earlier, but can we talk about some of the ways in which campaigns and super PACs are spending money, especially some of the more nefarious ways that we may not know about? I mean, we all sort of know about TV ads, but can we sort of dig into that a little bit?
Sure.
Start?
Sure. So there's all kinds of really interesting ways that campaigns and candidates spend money. So if your question is more about how you track that, how you find that, there's a couple of ways. With campaign data, as Shane was showing you, there's a disbursement option where you can look at the expenditures and things like that and look at everything they're spending, who they're giving to, and you can do some really interesting stories out of that. Sometimes they have family members on the payroll, and you can track that down by looking at the names of who's getting the money. Sometimes you see them paying the same business over and over, and then you start looking at maybe who owns the business or why. And sometimes you see things that don't really belong on campaign finance forms that make you start asking some questions. And the classic case of that is, of course, Representative Aaron Schock, who had to step down recently from Illinois, who had just years and years and years and years of campaign expenses that made no sense. I remember looking at his campaign expenses in 2012 and wondering about the luxury hotel in Athens, Greece, and the P90X DVDs, and quite a few other things that he wound up paying his campaign back for at the time, but apparently didn't quite learn his lesson. So, very often those things will jump out at you. And I think it's always worth asking a question of, why are you paying for a hotel in Greece? I don't see any expatriates with Greek addresses giving you money. I don't see any fundraising expenses in Greece. All I see is this luxury hotel in Greece. Can you tell me about that? And if you go in armed with that filing, they will have to answer that question usually.
Can I ask a question real quick? Do those go away once he pays back his campaign, or are they still visible, and can you see this was an expense but then retracted?
They are visible because what will happen is they'll have to file an amended report, or they'll put some sort of payment from him on a future report. So when campaign finance reports are amended, or when something is changed later, the original ones don't go away.
One sort of useful question you asked about campaign spending. Yes, campaigns file quarterly or semi-annually right now, and they're not technically campaigns like Jeb Bush has. But if they're buying television ads, that's disclosed in a far more real-time way by the FCC. This is one of the things that came up, what can you do through executive action? This was sort of created if you look up any TV station in America, you can look at their political file. You used to actually physically have to go into TV stations to pull this information. Now it's all online. And you can look at, this is, since we had WHO person here yesterday speaking, this is one of the biggest stations in Des Moines. It gets tons of political advertising from early on. Just right here, you can talk about the role of nonprofit groups and outside groups. There are 2 people who were registered federal candidates who spent money, 16 non-registered candidates for non-candidate issue ads. But you can click and you see exactly what people are buying, what television shows for what cost at what time of day. So you can get a great deal of detail on super PAC spending even before their quarterly filings come out. So this is the FCC's website. You can look for this yourself. Also, the Sunlight Foundation has a tool that's a little easier to look at it in the aggregate.
It's easier to search by candidate or something like that, as opposed to knowing a specific station already.
At the FCC, you have to know what station you're looking up. But through Sunlight, you can look up particular candidates. So that's a great tool to look those things.
What's the website on Sunlight?
So the Sunlight Foundation one, what is it called?
It's in your handout.
It's in our
It's in
handout.
our handout that we gave out, yeah.
Also, if you Google FCC TV buying and Sunlight, it would pop up, or you'll get. The Sunlight Foundation has a much more robust in terms of candidate searching tools.
And it's worth spending some time on their website. We highlighted a few things in our handout, but for instance, some of the filings that are the worst to go through that I'm not spending time on here today are lobbying filings by lobbyists who represent foreign governments, which have to be filed with the Justice Department. And those are terrible. They're not searchable in really almost any meaningful way. And Sunlight's really made some very good efforts to make them more searchable. So they have some great tools that it's worth playing with in your own time. More questions?
Good morning. I'm Olli Orsed, a Norwegian journalist. When it comes to foreign money, it's probably something that will come up, and also activities abroad. There is probably a lot of good, sexy stuff out there, but some of it is not as sexy as it might seem. I know, for instance, the Clinton Foundation got about $55 million from the Norwegian government. And that can, on paper, seem to be a lot of influence peddling. But most of that is actually money that is funneled through the foundation to aid projects in Africa. So, I think the Clinton Foundation get about a 7% cut of that or something. So there is some loose change behind from those $55 million. So when you start dealing with foreign contributions, it's important to also extend the research, reach out to maybe colleagues in other countries, or Washington, D.C. is full of foreign journalists, and actually get some help to go through that, because it sounds a lot if the Norwegian government gave $55 million to the Clinton Foundation, but it actually is just routed through in very specific kind of projects.
Well, there's sort of 2 things I'd say. The first is Norway is just an awesome example, because you can actually get great information from foreign governments, because some other countries have more robust public records laws than the United States. Norway is one of them. So if you want communications with American officials, ask the Norwegian government for the communications. Yeah. Truthfully, Norway, Scotland, there's a handful of governments. I don't know why I know some of them, but so yeah.
With great commitments to transparency.
Yeah, so some countries do have better information when you're talking about covering foreign information. In terms of like following that, I do think there's a question, if you're the Norwegian government and you have $55 million and you want to help Africa, you are choosing to use the Clinton Foundation as the vehicle to do that. There's a conscious choice to use that foundation versus giving directly to particular other projects. And I think that's the fair question you can raise, even if most of the money's going to.
Yeah, I agree with that, but I'm just, I think this is going to come up as in foreign money and foreign contributions, and it's important to actually look at that, because, I mean, there's $1 billion that went through the Gates Foundation and other things from the Norwegian government, as far as I know. So.
And you make a good point, which is always, okay, someone gave the money. What did the money get used for? Why did they give it? Reporting that out as opposed to just going with the simple story, I think is always important, and will always add something.
And there's one other resource we haven't mentioned, and you touched on it briefly. FARA.gov,
Yeah.
FARA.gov.
It's on the handout.
Is the documentation of all foreign government, people working for foreign governments who are paid by them, interacting with American officials and American journalists. So if you are, it basically comes from the communist era. The idea was if you are a foreign country trying to influence America, either through the government or through the media, you have to report your interactions.
I think it predates that. It's like
It's
a
even
World War
before
II
that.
propaganda
Okay.
law,
World
an
War-
anti-propaganda law.
And so, like, you can see the XYZ government, here are the following officials in the State Department they called on these days. So there's a lot of robust tools. And often, one of the stories that I brought potentially to talk about was looking at the way members of Congress have found to take free trips, often through lobbyists, post-Abramoff era. And it's a story that started with reporting from House government disclosures and ended up looking at FARA filings. Then ended up some of those filings you can only get if you show up at the Department of Justice. And you have to go through all kinds of different sets of data. But ultimately, you get out good stories from these things, and there's way more information than you think available about most things.
Right. It's just easy to get deterred because it's not readily searchable. But they do have to disclose much more. And I should say that one thing to always be on the lookout for is people violating that law, because that law has very strict penalties, and it's enforced by the Department of Justice directly. Those filings are made with the Department of Justice, and violating it is not a joke. So most lobbyists are pretty careful to comply with the FARA laws, even if they're not as careful about some of the other lobbying disclosures, which I regret to say some of them are not.
Carrie and Shane, this is fantastic. Thank you so much for this. So if I wanted you guys to see if you could kind of step back. You've given this mountain of incredibly rich information on the handout and on the website. And if you guys are kind of, the elite marathoners in campaign coverage, and we have other journalists in the room who will go to some of these sites now and then in search of a very particular, some piece of information to enhance a particular story. But I was struck, Shane, by your observations about how you kind of accidentally trip over stories as you did in preparing for today's presentation. So I'm wondering if you could kind of, I don't know what this looks like, like the food pyramid or a daily exercise or a weekly, if you were advising people on that point, you're not going to be looking at this every day for 8 hours or 10 hours or whatever you guys are doing, but what do you sort of need to do, and knowing what you know about the depth of information on these individual sites, knowing what you know about how frequently they're updated, how the filing deadlines and all of that, what would you tell journalists they need to be doing, and how often to be able to come upon those stories that they don't even know exist versus I'm pursuing information about this particular piece? Well,
First off, Carrie's really the expert at this because she does spend all her time doing this. I don't have that luxury because I'm supposed to cover the broader 2016 campaign and who's saying what and the like. But I find that usually the best stories are when I find the time to do this. And so I'd make the argument, no matter what your job is, and my job title doesn't say campaign finance reporter, and I don't think it ever has, is that this is really, as I open up, selfishly, it's way easier to break a good story on this beat because so few people are looking at it. And if you're at an event, there's 100 people there. So the first thing is just make some time out of your day. Know when the filing deadlines are. There are people who have every month, this is when the political parties file. I don't look at those every month because it's just not something I have the planning to put together, but the quarterly filings. And the big thing is everyone's gonna look for the same thing. How much did they raise? Maybe how much did they spend? And that aggregate number, all the best stories are in the details. Who they spent their money with, how much they paid them. If one Republican campaign is paying their campaign manager $40,000 a month and another is paying them $5,000, that's a great story. And you're only gonna get that by looking at a bunch of them and who's paying whom. So I think just making it a priority, even if it's not your full-time job, it's totally worthwhile. And you get better stories out of it.
I think too, local reporters have an advantage that Shane and I don't. First of all, my job is more to step back and do projects. So I'm not necessarily writing off every filing that comes in, even if I'm looking at a lot of things anymore. But I used to. When I was covering lobbying, I used to look every day to see what the new registrations were and write off them, or do a quick item off a filing. And those are easy to do and they're fun. And the nice thing about doing that once in a while, even if it's not your beat, is that it keeps you looking at those filings and remembering how to ask questions about what's in them. It keeps you from getting rusty and thinking, God, I haven't looked at this in forever. How do I read it again? And so if you look at them enough, you'll be comfortable with them and you'll spot the strange little things when they come in. You'll get some practice when you're not under pressure. And I think that that's always a good idea no matter what your beat is. What I would say is obviously, yes, know the filing deadlines. If you're covering a congressional race in your state, if you're covering a Senate race in your state, make sure you're looking at those filings when they come in. Keep an eye on them and keep an eye out for when they change them, because that can be a really interesting thing too. When amendments and things come in, it's always worth asking what changed.
This was a trick that the 2012 presidential campaigns did. And I don't remember the specifics of it, but you can choose to file either quarterly or monthly. And you would think by switching from quarterly to monthly, you'd get your filings more often. But for whatever reason, right around the Iowa caucuses and the New Hampshire caucuses, all the campaigns switched from quarterly to monthly, and that actually bought them an extra month of not disclosing their spending.
And there also was something right before the 2014 elections, a bunch, I'm trying to remember the details, but there were several new super PACs that formed. So even though there were, even though super PACs have to disclose because of the date that they formed the group, they weren't going to have to disclose till after the election who their donors were. And so that's something to keep an eye out as those filing deadlines pass. There's a date beyond which your disclosure deadlines move past the election. And so there's tricks like that to watch out for if a new group pops up and starts spending money in your state the week before the election. So there's things like that that are good to keep an eye on. But I would say if you're a local reporter, you may have the luxury of sort of being focused, of looking at the data and saying, okay, I'm interested in the filings from this campaign, and I'm just always going to remember to look at the filings from this campaign.
Hey, just curious, how often do you guys look at the personal financial disclosures? That seems like a little bit trickier than FEC.gov and things like that, and it's nice that they post them. I don't think they used to post them, but that's kind of where the good stories of like who has monetary interest in different places.
I personally probably spend more time looking at their personal financial disclosures because I think that you can tell really interesting stories about people, especially if you look at them over time. I thought I came up with this. I ended up coming up with a good story last year, but I thought I came up with like a different story entirely when I was looking up people's disclosure filings for how much money they had, and on those you had to disclose what free trips you took if you were a member of Congress. And I knew a bunch of freshmen had gone to Israel, and I saw like 1, 2, 3 didn't report this trip. I was like, awesome, all these people didn't report this trip. This is great, I'm gonna write this story. And then ended up there were like 14 of them that didn't report the trip. And I was like, why are there 14 people not? That doesn't make sense. And it turned out that the House had deleted the requirement that you report these free trips on this annual financial disclosure form. And so that was probably a far bigger story, that they had basically behind closed doors deleted a requirement of these disclosures. Yeah, I think it's totally worthwhile. The bands of income that people have in there, it's pretty broad, but you can see what they're invested in, if they have stocks or mutual funds. You can see conflicts of interest.
Property.
You can see what property they have. You can see if they're
Mortgages.
earning pensions. I'm going to forget her name. The second-term congresswoman from Ohio, Joyce Beatty, has a pension from her service to the state of Ohio for $250,000 a year because she spiked her pension by going to the public university as like a provost for a 3-year period, which is the minimum to get a full pension after serving in the state legislature. So she has a $250,000 pension that shows up on her financial disclosure that you would otherwise not see.
And you see book royalties and things like that. Marco Rubio, for instance, has had considerable book royalties that show up on his financial disclosure. Bernie Sanders, less considerable book royalties, the bulk of which, I should say in fairness, I think he donated to charity. But you can see things like that make for interesting tidbits. And also, there are some requirements now that the members of Congress disclose financial transactions, stock transactions, when they make them. And so those forms will come in separately. So I try and check. I don't have an exact regimen for how often I check, but I try and make it a pretty often thing to just browse through those and see what there is. And you can do some fun stories out of it. You know, if you can say this many, members of Congress own Apple stock or something like that. And you've done some fun stories. There's people like Eric Cantor, who you wrote about, whose wife was on a lot of boards. And so that led to some good disclosures for you.
If you're in the if you're physically in the Capitol, in the House of Representatives in the basement, they have a room where you can access basically all the staff financial disclosures, as well as a database of almost in real time what stocks members of Congress are trading. This was a change from a few years ago. So you can see who's trading what stocks. I thought it was going to be a great story. It turned out there was no story there at all. Right ahead of the government shutdown, I thought there was going to be a good story about people like de-investing from the market. It turned out really not true. But so sometimes you just lose a day, right? I spent a day in the basement of a windowless office, but I don't know, at least I wasn't at my desk.
Last question.
What's your recommendations or view of money coming from Saudi Arabia or Qatar in the political campaign?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the last part?
What's your recommendations on how to work on a story involving money coming from Saudi Arabia or Qatar in the political campaign?
Into a company?
No,
Campaign.
in the political
Into a campaign.
Yes.
Well, they can't directly give to campaigns. Foreign governments can't, and foreign nationals can't. So I think the question for all of us becomes, how do we look for that money going into nonprofits? And some of the earlier sessions have touched on that.
I mean, if you have any knowledge of Saudi
Yeah.
Arabia spending
Please
money
see us after the panel.
influence a political campaign, I think that's an awesome story. It would have to be fairly indirect. Yeah.
One tiny thing, there was a great story, I think it was the Post that broke that story about maybe it was the Times, all the money that went from Middle Eastern and other countries to think tanks. So
Yeah.
they use
Right.
that as a means to influence policy.
Yes, and there are these third-party groups that we are all watching, all these different ways that people influence. And so, but I also think too, there are a lot of questions that get asked all the time to American subsidiaries of foreign companies who say it's not fair to treat them differently than any other American company. They all have PACs and say that the money in that, they have to be careful to make sure it comes from American citizens who are connected to the company. So this stuff can get very complicated very quickly.
And the just last thing on the role of money basically being funneled through nonprofits, which if that's happening, would be through that venue. Donors, politicians, everyone prefers their money secret. They will say that's not the case, but basically the data shows it's true. And my favorite example of this is in the Kentucky Senate race last year, where Scott Jennings, who's now the political director for Jeb Bush's not quite yet presidential campaign, ran a political nonprofit and a super PAC at the exact same time. And what he was doing is he'd go to donors and say, hey, I'm raising money to help Mitch McConnell for this super PAC and also to promote conservative ideas for this nonprofit group that might potentially benefit Mitch McConnell. And if you look at the end of the day, it was the secret money nonprofit group, which was hamstrung by rules of how they could spend their money. This is not where Scott Jennings wanted the money to go, but that's where the money came from donors. The nonprofit group outspent the super PAC in the race and was, in fact, I think the single biggest advertiser outside of the candidates was a nonprofit group, none of the super PACs. Again, and this is one of the most target races in the entire country.
Yeah, and I should say my colleague Michael Beckel did a great story about this group right before the election, and it's really worth a read. And the last thought that I guess I'd throw out there that we haven't talked about, which is when you're covering campaigns, I think it's also important to look for the absence of money. So there are some races where really there isn't a lot of outside spending, and it's worth asking why, what's keeping people away. And you can get some good stories like that. I think the example from the most recent election cycle was I did a really fun story right after the election about the Virginia Senate race and how Ed Gillespie, who helped found American Crossroads and has been a giant Republican fundraiser and RNC guy for I don't even know how long, ran for Senate, had what looked like the closest race in the country on election night. I mean, came within inches of beating Warner. And really, there was no significant outside money in that race, nothing. They all left him out there because they all thought he had no shot. And they were all kicking themselves the day after because, $5 or $10 million in that race, and he might have won it. And so sometimes you can get a really good story, too, when you look at why people stay away and the lessons the outside groups are now going to take from that when they go into the 2016 cycle. So it's worth looking for what's not there as well as what's there.
Thanks so much, Carrie and Shane.